Something very strange has just happened in Formula One. Because the FIA has published new evidence after thoroughly inspecting George Russell's car after the sprint qualifying of the Chinese Grand Prix, an investigation that did not focus on aerodynamics or the engine as normally happens, but on one of the most sensitive and difficult to control areas of a modern Formula One: the system that connects the accelerator pedal with the actual power delivery of the car. The surprising thing is that this review was extremely in-depth, analyzing sensors, electronic maps, and the connection with the standardized electronic unit of the car, something that normally only happens when the Federation wants to ensure that there is no type of hidden advantage. But what is really shaking the paddock is not only the investigation, but the reaction it has provoked within Formula One, because several teams began to wonder how it was possible for the Mercedes to show such solid behavior in such a complicated weekend as China. And the most shocking of all is that Lewis Hamilton was completely surprised when he began to analyze what was happening with the W17. However, in Formula One the story rarely ends when a technical report appears. In fact, many times that is precisely the moment when the real debate begins. Because even if the FIA has confirmed that the car is legal, the simple fact that such a specific investigation has been carried out is already enough to fuel conversations within the paddock. Rival teams are beginning to wonder why exactly that system was revised and if there really is something in the behavior of the Mercedes that they have not yet fully understood. Added to all this is a context that makes the situation even more interesting. The Chinese Grand Prix weekend had a sprint format, meaning the teams barely had a practice session before heading straight into qualifying. That type of format leaves very little room to adjust the car and usually quickly exposes which teams arrive better prepared from a technical point of view. On a circuit like Shanghai, furthermore, the drivers were dealing with a recent resurfacing that had completely changed the grip level of the track, causing much faster lap times and making the car's behavior more difficult to predict. In the midst of all these variables, Russell's Mercedes became one of the benchmarks of the weekend. Its performance seemed particularly strong in conditions where other cars were struggling to find the right balance between traction, stability, and tire management. That performance was what ended up raising the first questions within the paddock and what finally led the FIA to decide to closely analyze one of the most critical systems of the car. But what no one expected was that this situation would also provoke an unexpected reaction from one of the biggest names in Formula One, Lewis Hamilton. Because when a driver with 7 world championships sees something in a car that catches his attention, the rest of the paddock begins to pay much more attention. And in this case, what Hamilton saw when analyzing what was happening with the Mercedes was enough to generate surprise even for someone who knows perfectly how the team's internal systems work. What started as a simple technical investigation is now turning into one of the most intriguing stories of the season opener. Because in Formula One there is something that always repeats itself. When a car seems to have an advantage that others still don't understand, the question that everyone starts asking is exactly the same. Are we simply seeing a very well-executed design, or are we looking at an innovation that could change the balance of the championship? From that moment on, the situation began to escalate much faster than anyone within the paddock expected. Because it is one thing for the FIA to carry out a detailed technical inspection and confirm that everything is legal, something that happens many times throughout a season. But it is quite another matter that this inspection focuses exactly on one of the most critical areas of the car and that it also occurs just after a car has shown performance that raises questions among rival teams. And that was precisely what transformed this episode into one of the most talked about topics of the weekend in China. From that point on, the story began to take an even more interesting turn within the paddock, because when a technical investigation like this becomes public, it immediately changes the way in which teams observe the performance of the car involved. Every lap, every corner exit, and every acceleration begins to be analyzed with much greater attention. And that was exactly what happened to George Russell's Mercedes after the FIA confirmed that it had thoroughly revised the car's accelerator system. Although the official report made it clear that everything was legal, the reality is that in Formula One the legality of a technical solution does not mean that the rest of the team stop trying to understand how it works. In fact, the opposite often happens. The more efficient a solution seems, the greater the interest in deciphering it. Rival engineers began to analyze the car's behavior in more detail than ever. They reviewed the available telemetry, compared speed data at different points on the circuit, and especially observed the moments in which the driver stepped on the accelerator again after a slow corner. At that moment is where one of the most critical transitions of the entire car occurs, because the car goes from braking and turning to trying to apply all the power possible without losing traction. If at that moment the car responds in a cleaner, more progressive and more stable way than the others, the driver can accelerate earlier and gain meters that are later transformed into tenths of a second at the end of the straight. And that is precisely what several teams began to suspect was happening with the Mercedes. It was not necessarily a huge difference visible to the naked eye, but rather a feeling of control and stability that seemed to make life easier for the driver in a very delicate phase of driving. When the car manages to apply power smoothly, the driver can trust more in the car's behavior and attack the corners more aggressively, knowing that the exit will be more predictable. In modern Formula One, where the differences between cars are usually minimal, such an improvement can make a significant difference over an entire lap. In this context, the FIA investigation becomes even more relevant. Technicians reviewed the system that connects the accelerator pedal to the championship's standardized electronic unit, the SECU, and analyzed the sensors that record the position of the pedal, the calibration maps loaded into the system, and the algorithms that adapt the signal before it is transformed into real engine torque. It is an extremely thorough analysis because that set of elements is what determines exactly how the car responds when the driver steps on the accelerator. After reviewing all these components, the Federation confirmed that the Mercedes system worked within the limits allowed by the technical regulations and that there was no irregularity in the car. However, inside the paddock, the story was far from over. When one team demonstrates particularly strong performance in an area as important as power delivery, the rest of the teams immediately start working to try to understand what is happening. Some teams are beginning to study the possibility that there is a more efficient way to calibrate the electronic throttle system within the regulations, while others are analyzing whether the advantage may be related to the way the car manages engine torque in combination with tire grip. This is where the experience of drivers like Lewis Hamilton takes on a particularly interesting role. Hamilton has spent years working within Mercedes' technical environment and is well aware of the complexity of the electronic systems that control engine response. Therefore, when the details of the FIA investigation and the specific area of the car that had been searched began to emerge, his reaction was one of surprise. Not because he necessarily suspected an irregularity, but because he understands better than anyone how difficult it is to find significant improvements in an area of the car that is so regulated by the regulations. His reaction made it clear that even within the world of Formula One there is a certain astonishment at what is happening with the behavior of the Mercedes. Meanwhile, the sporting context also begins to give more weight to this whole story. The championship is just beginning and it is still too early to establish a definitive competitive order between the teams. The first races of the season are usually especially important because they show which teams have best interpreted the regulations and which are still trying to find the ideal balance of their cars. In this scenario, any car that demonstrates consistency from the start can quickly become a technical reference for the rest of the grid. Furthermore, the Chinese Grand Prix itself was held under very particular conditions. The Shanghai circuit had recently been resurfaced, which considerably increased the level of grip and allowed the drivers to lap several seconds faster than in previous seasons. That change in surface altered the behavior of the cars and forced the teams to quickly adapt to a different environment, especially considering that the sprint format of the weekend left very little time to make adjustments to the car configuration. In such a demanding scenario, any car that manages to maintain stable and predictable behavior immediately becomes an advantage for the driver. And Russell's Mercedes seemed to be doing exactly that. While some teams were still searching for the right balance between traction, stability, and power management, the silver car showed a consistency that was difficult to ignore. Therefore, although the FIA has confirmed that everything is legal, the story of the W17 is far from over. In Formula One, every innovation that seems to offer a small advantage ends up being studied, copied, or even questioned by rivals. And that means that, in the coming races, engineers from all over the grid will be closely observing every detail of the Mercedes behavior, trying to discover if there really is something special in the way the car delivers its power. Because if Mercedes has found a particularly clever interpretation of the regulations in this system, it could have discovered an advantage that the rest of the paddock is still trying to understand. After everything that happened at the Chinese Grand Prix, it is clear that the publication of the FIA tests on George Russell's car has opened one of the most interesting technical stories of this start of the season. What began as a detailed inspection ended up becoming a central issue within the paddock. Not because an irregularity was found, but because the investigation focused exactly on one of the most sensitive and complex areas of an entire modern Formula One: the system that transforms the pressure of the accelerator pedal into the actual delivery of engine power. Federation technicians analyzed sensors, electronic maps, connections with the standardized electronic unit, and the algorithms that manage the accelerator signal before converting it into engine torque. After this entire process, the verdict was clear. The car completely complies with the technical regulations and there is no illegality in the operation of the car. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.